It is the responsibility of my office to host the Lowell lecture. And it's a long-held history. The Lowell Institute, as some of you may know, began in 1836. There's only 2 people in this room who might remember that. And we'll just let you guess who that might be. One of the joys of the Lowell Institute is each year they invite us to make application for this lecture series. And each year, in collaboration with the dean and the faculty of this school, we spend some time to evaluate what it is people are talking about, what is coming up in community conversation, and where we need to go. Over this year, we decided to do something very different, and that is 3 different lectures over the period of the academic year. The first was held a week before the general election, and Dean Sapiro of the College of Arts and Sciences presented our first lecture. It was poorly attended because people were in the middle of midterms and thinking about many things and didn't want one more word about an election. But it was an astonishing evening, and that you can see on B Universe, because we record each of these evenings, and they're ready for your consumption and conversion as needs be must. This lecture will be introduced by Dean Mary Elizabeth Moore, and our third lecture will be held on April the 9th, again in this location, and we are presenting 2 outstanding speakers, Chief Justice of the which nation?
Chickasaw.
Chickasaw Nation. I've had so many C's, I've called it Cherokee and others. So it's the Chickasaw Nation, as well as the Bishop of Wisconsin. Yes. And so on that evening, we will be exploring not only civil discourse, but the notion of holy conferencing and holy conversation. All of these discussions on civil discourse this year have really been designed to help this community of the School of Theology and the greater Boston metropolitan area and New England to think through what does civil discourse mean and how do you enact it in real life. And rather than presenting a kind of academic approach to this, we've been really working to present to you a living approach. How do people in real decision-making places come to articulate the problem, and how do they work through it and solve it? We are delighted you are here. Again, I apologize that the repast promised before the lecture was not available, but some things are actually out of my control, which shocks me no end, actually. But more specifically, we will have food and refreshment for you immediately following this evening, so you will have something to look forward to past the brilliance that you're about to experience one-on-one. Let me then present for the introductions this evening our dean, our leader, our mentor, Mary Elizabeth Moore.
Thank you so much for being here. Your presence is as important as the presence of those who will be presenting. There is nothing in our society that is more important than civil discourse if we are to build a just and peaceful world. There is nothing in our society that is more easy to distort than civil discourse. Civil discourse can be an excuse for politeness that keeps some people quiet while others hold the floor. Civil discourse can be a fluffy addition to business as usual. We carry on business as usual and we call it something fancy like civil discourse or holy conversation, but it's really the same old, same old. We are trying this year to explore what civil discourse really means, if it is to take our hearts and change our ways and build a just and peaceful world. No panel could be more helpful in helping us explore this than the one we have tonight. I'm going to introduce the respondents first, using largely their words, and then I'll introduce our speaker. Our moderator for the evening is Bishop Susan Hassinger. And those of us who are here at the School of Theology know her well. She teaches courses on spirituality and leadership. Many things you may not know about her is that she has been a bishop for many years, and she served her term. She retired and was called out of retirement 2 different times because she's particularly agile at helping annual conferences and human beings work through knotty issues like combining annual conferences that have been separate, and so that her latest term was doing that. But she is a half-time lecturer with us here at the School of Theology. She was one of the co-founders, one of the dream team who envisioned the Just Peace movement within the United Methodist Church. She's well known as a consultant in this area. She is an outstanding teacher, spiritual mentor, and guru on all matters related to leadership and spirituality. Our first respondent will be Will Green, who's a student, an MDiv student here at the School of Theology and the pastor of the St. Nicholas United Methodist Church in Hull, Massachusetts. Will has served on the board of directors of the Reconciling Ministries Network, and he's actively engaged in working for the full inclusion of GLBTQ people in the United Methodist Church. Our other respondent is also very active as an elder in the Northern Illinois Conference of the United Methodist Church. Our own Pamela Lightsey, Associate Dean for Community Life and Lifelong Learning. Dean Lightsey, Dr. Lightsey, has served as a pastor in South Chicago. She has served as Dean of Student Affairs at Garrett Evangelical School of Theology, and we are very fortunate she's here with us. What may not be apparent to those of us who see her day in and day out here at the School of Theology is that she's also a very active leader within the denomination. She's very active in the Reconciling Ministries Network. She's on the executive committee for the Soul Repair Project, which studies the role of moral injury in veterans. And she has been an active leader, both formally and informally, toward the full inclusion of GLBTQ folks within the United Methodist Church, but within the larger society and within the larger ecumenical church. Those will be the people we hear from after we hear from our major speaker, who is Bishop Melvin Talbert. Pause. We are standing on holy ground. Those of you who were in chapel yesterday, Wednesday, heard Bishop Talbert preach. Bishop Talbert is a man who speaks from the depths and centers of his heart. He is a man who has such integrity that when the United Methodist Church tries to censor him for the roles he's taken in most recent times, the White Methodists for Church Renewal and other groups publicly proclaim that they will stand behind him, stand beside him. Bishop Talbot grew up in Louisiana. His first degree was in secondary education. When he experienced the call to ministry in college, he went to seminary, but he went to seminary to prove to himself and others that he was not called to ordained ministry. Lo and behold, he was. So he completed seminary, he was ordained, and he began serving churches. Also during this period, he became active in the Student Nonviolent SNCC. In 1960, he helped organize sit-ins in Atlanta, the very first sit-ins. Martin Luther King Jr. joined in those sit-ins, and they shared a jail cell for a few days. In 1980, after serving churches in the California Pacific Annual Conference, Melvin Talbert was elected bishop. He served in 2 different annual conferences, the Pacific Northwest and Northern California, Nevada. He also served in roles that I want you to be aware of, because he has been very active as a leader in ecumenical affairs as well as in the denomination. He served as secretary of the Council of Bishops. He served, that's in the United Methodist Church. He served as president of the National Council of Churches of Christ, USA. He attended every general conference of the United Methodist Church since 1968, and that itself is heroic. Before being elected bishop, in addition to serving local churches, he was the executive secretary for the General Board of Discipleship and led that board in major new directions. He also, in retirement, has served a 4-year term as the ecumenical officer for the Council of Bishops and as president of the Churches Uniting in Christ, the CUIC. He served as adjunct professor of United Methodist Polity and Practice at Vanderbilt University, where he still serves, by the way, and as executive director of the National Black Methodist for Church Renewal from 2004 to 2007. I would call that a very active retirement. I share this because I want you to be aware that this man is not only a leader within a denomination, he is an ecumenical leader, and he is a fearless prophet for racial, gender, and sexual and gender orientation, racial, gender, and sexual orientation inclusiveness. He believes, and this is a direct quote, there is room at God's table for everyone. Let us welcome our guest, Bishop Talbert, and let us be prepared to ground ourselves in this holy place at this holy moment.
Distinguished faculty, students, staff, guests, and friends of Boston University School of Theology, sisters and brothers, good evening.
Good evening.
I extend to you warm greetings in the name and in the spirit of Jesus Christ. I'm honored and I'm grateful to my longtime colleague and friend, Dr. Mary Elizabeth Moore, Dean, for her gracious invitation to Marilyn and me to visit this campus of this great seminary. And I'm more than honored to be asked to deliver one of the Lowell lectures. That is indeed an honor and privilege. This is my first visit to this historic campus. Many of my colleagues in ministry are and were graduates of this institution. This seminary has an illustrious history and has illumined the minds and illumined the minds of many visionary leaders in this nation and around the world. Of course, one of those illustrious leaders was the late Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. And then, as I preached on yesterday, I was reminded of the illustrious leadership of the late Dr. Howard Thurman, one that I had the privilege of meeting on several occasions. And what a privilege that was. Before getting into the major portion of my lecture, allow me to share a part of my story. Dr. Moore shared with you a part of that. I'm the son of sharecropper parents from the small country town of Clinton, Louisiana. I was born and raised in a racially segregated society. Every aspect of my early life was structured around the great racial divide, black and white. In my early childhood, I discerned from the teachings of my parents and my church that something was wrong with that picture. I knew within my soul that I could not survive in that environment. So I began looking for ways to escape. After completing high school, I entered Southern University at Baton Rouge, Louisiana. But due to an unexpected illness, I dropped out of college. And during that interim period, my maternal grandfather died, and his death precipitated a family dispute. His farm was sold in a sheriff's sale. And fortunately, the person who purchased the farm represented my mom and dad. So he sold the farm to us for the exact amount that he purchased it, and gave us 5 years to repay the loan. And he held the mortgage. So, for 4 years I worked in a variety of common labor jobs to help mom and dad pay for the farm. And when the final payment was made 4 years later, I began reflecting on the future direction of my life. My older brother came to visit from Chicago, and he invited me to go back to Chicago with him to work in the steel mill, and I agreed. I packed my bag and was off to Chicago. But we went to my little church prior to leaving. And fortunately, my pastor, who was a young, energetic, upstart pastor, asked me, where was I going? And I told him. He said, well, don't you leave until you talk to me after the service. When the service was over, he just came walking and he said, where's your brother's car? And took him to the car. Where's your bag? He said, it's in the trunk. Open the trunk. He literally took the trunk out of the back of my brother's car and placed it in his car. And he said, you're going to Southern University with me today. Chicago will be there after you finish Southern University. Now, during my final semester at college, I discovered that preparation for being a secondary education teacher at Clinton was not something I wanted to do. So I had a long struggle of the soul. Following conversations with several key persons in my life, I was confronted with the call to the ordained ministry. They helped me to recognize what was going on. And finally, one night in my bed, in my room, there were 6 of us in the room, but this particular night, I was there alone. I allowed myself to consider the ordained ministry. And it was as though I was standing before a dark tunnel, and a light pierced the darkness and soared into infinity. And my response was, all right, God. All right, God, I'm going to give it a try. And so I agreed and went to seminary. And I entered seminary in the spring semester of 1959. And of course, I had no intention of staying in seminary because I didn't want to be a preacher. That was the last thing that I wanted to do with my life. But engagement with professors and students in seminary hooked me. And so in the fall of 1960, I became involved in the sit-in demonstrations in Atlanta, the sit-in movements. I made the commitment to nonviolence. we invited Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to join us in the sit-in demonstrations, and he was arrested with us, and I was privileged to spend 3 days and 3 nights in the same jail cell with him. And that experience changed and shaped my life and directions forever. I consider myself to be a disciple of Dr. King's nonviolent movement, which changed the direction of this country. And the King-Gandhi philosophy of nonviolence shaped my entire ministry beyond seminary, and it continues to shape my witness and ministry in retirement. Now, the intersection of oppression and privilege. In this lecture, which is not intended to be a scholarly treatise, I can only scratch the surface of the issues and concerns underlying the topic that I shall discuss. The intersection of oppression and privilege is a reality for all of us. The question is, how do we embrace that reality in a way that fosters the beloved community envisioned by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.? After prayerful reflection, I came to the conclusion that it would be most beneficial for me to approach this subject out of my own experience as a person of color, a person who has known oppression. My oppression had to do with race. An African American born and lived through a time when Jim Crow law was my reality and my church sanctioned my oppression. I learned early in life that race prejudice is a reality for all races, not just white folk. In my earlier life, I hated white people who did such terrible things to us. Each of us is guilty of race prejudice and race bias. In the book Set Free, A Journey Towards Solidarity Against Racism by Iris de Leon Hartshorn, Tobin Miller Scherer, and Regina Shands Schultzfuss, I found this statement that sums up my experiences of oppression, and I quote, "Racism is not the same as racial prejudice. Where racial prejudice is held by many of us, regardless of our skin color, racism is only present when a given group in society has the power to enforce their prejudices so that they receive more benefits and privileges than other groups." So racism equals prejudice. Racism equals race prejudice plus the misuse of systemic power. In my early days, in the sit-in demonstration days in the South, we understood racism to be prejudice plus power. So we had to learn how to deal with prejudice plus power at the point that it intersected with our oppression. Now these authors conclude that racism is like an iceberg afloat in the sea of life in our society. Racism is not as one-dimensional as the definition suggests. It can be found in 3 primary manifestations: individual, institutional, and systemic. Likewise, each of these manifestations has 3 levels: oppressive power, white power, and identity power. Let's take a quick look at this racism iceberg. Oppressive power of racism is what we see and what we experience. It's the visible acts that are part of the larger system which says that people of color are not human. So it's all right to hurt them and to deny them basic human rights of equal access to benefits and privileges. And some examples of oppressive power of racism are separate but equal public accommodations, churches and schools. I can still see in my mind those white-only, colored-only signs. I can still feel the sting of oppression that was so evident in those early years. Other manifestations were denying equal opportunity for employment for people of color in every aspect of society. But the other level is white power. You don't see it. It's underneath the surface. But that's the core of racism. It is where racism's purpose resides, because racism is not really about hurting people of color. It is about giving privilege and power to white people. Within the system of racism, white people are superior. Things that happen at the tip of the iceberg, the oppressive power, happen because of the core. Some examples of this level of power are the enactment of laws to make legal the right of white people to discriminate based on race. So the white-only, the colored-only signs were legal and were vigorously enforced by law enforcement personnel. To violate such laws could result in being arrested and jailed with severe and extreme penalties, whether you were colored, quote, or white. But the most damaging level of racism is at the base of the iceberg. Here, racism claims the power to tell people of color and white people who they are. As we all know, God has already solved this problem. We are all part of the family of God, no exceptions. Yet, racism attempts to usurp the authority of God. It is at the identity level that racism begins to shape us and tells us what to think and what to feel about others. From the early 1950s to the signing of the Civil Rights Act of 1965, the civil rights struggle was about dissolving the racism iceberg. It was about challenging the status quo of racial segregation and reframing the issue of race to a new level of understanding that all human beings are created in the image of God. Thus, black people began believing that they were somebody. They began believing and feeling that they were equal and had a right to all the basic human dignity and freedoms in civil society. It was through this struggle that I became the person that I am today. During the sit-in demonstrations in the summer of 1960, I made that commitment to nonviolence, which meant that I would sit in white public accommodations and refuse to leave. I was willing to be arrested and go to jail to protest the immoral and unjust laws of separate but equal. I was arrested and spent jail time in the same cell with Dr. King. Now, those hours with Dr. King changed my life. I became convinced that Gandhi's concept of soul force, love, was the greatest resource for bringing about change in the world. And Dr. King challenged us to let love be the motivating influence in our lives. He reminded us that Jesus was all about love. Love your enemies. Love your neighbor. Do good to those who mistreat you. Turn the other cheek. Now, throughout my ministry, when faced with challenging or difficult issues or decisions, I inevitably found myself being reminded of my commitment to nonviolence and to the encounter with Dr. King. When we as angry black radicals expressed our hate of white people, I shall never forget how Dr. King kept reminding us that Bull Connors and George Wallace were our brothers. On one occasion, he looked at me and said, "Melvin Talbert, you know better because George Wallace is a Methodist." I have frequently stated that Dr. King was the greatest ally white America ever had, even though publicly he was excoriated, criticized, and rejected. But he was the greatest ally that white America ever had because he refused to embrace the rhetoric of hate espoused by some black leaders. So I stand before you tonight and I declare boldly that all of you are my sisters and brothers. We're members of the one family, the human family, the family of God. I further declare that racism is a sin against God and humanity. Racism is an evil that must be identified, addressed, and eradicated from our community. However, our most recent presidential election is a reminder that racism is still alive and well in every aspect of our society. The unfinished task and challenge of eradicating racism is still before us. But my experience of racism suggests that there are other icebergs afloat in the sea of humanity and deserve some in-depth exploration in our churches and in society. Two of these icebergs are heterosexism and sexism. First, the iceberg of heterosexism. As a matter of personal confession, I am not gay. I'm straight. So I have some deep reservations regarding my effort to share perspectives on what it's like to be a person of a different sexual orientation or gender identity. But I have known oppression. So I do claim my capacity to empathize and to proclaim what I understand to be God's truth of who we are as human beings. Without exception, we are each part of God's family. As heterosexuals of every race and culture, we have our prejudices and biases regarding persons with different sexual orientation and gender identity. And I'm sure that persons of different sexual orientation or gender identity have their prejudices and biases regarding heterosexuality. But like racism, heterosexism is not the same as heterosexual prejudice. Heterosexism is heterosexual prejudice plus power. It is the misuse of heterosexual systemic power. And my contention is that we as heterosexuals must explore the depth of heterosexism for the purpose of intentionally taking steps to rid ourselves of the sin of heterosexism that plagues us as a church and as society. Now, using the iceberg analogy, heterosexism has three primary manifestations: individual, institutional, systemic. And likewise, each of these manifestations have three levels: oppressive power, heterosexual power, and identity power. The oppressive power of heterosexism is the visible acts or expressions that hurt persons of a different sexual orientation or gender identity and denies them their basic human rights and full access to all benefits and privileges. And some examples of oppressive power of heterosexism are, number one, the killing of Matthew Shepard. That's individual manifestation. The United Methodist Church enshrining incompatibility language in its Book of Discipline. That's institutional manifestation. And churches and other groups coercing gay and lesbian persons to go through brainwashing processes to enable them to become heterosexual. That's systemic manifestation. Now, of course, heterosexual power is the core of heterosexism. This is the place where heterosexism's purpose resides. Heterosexism is not really about hurting persons of a different sexual orientation or gender identity. It is about giving privilege and power to the heterosexuals. Now, within the system of heterosexism, heterosexual people are superior. The things that happen at the tip of the iceberg, the oppressive power level, happen because of the core. Some examples of heterosexual power are characterizing all gay persons as immoral. That's individual. Churches not ordaining persons of different sexual orientation or gender identity. That's institutional. Only heterosexual lifestyles portrayed in church literature or magazines. That's systemic. Now, identity power is the base of the iceberg. It is the most damaging level of heterosexism. It is heterosexism claiming the power to tell heterosexual persons and persons with different sexual orientation or gender identity who they are. Heterosexism attempts to usurp the authority of God. It is at the identity power level that heterosexism begins to shape us and to tell us what to think and what to feel about ourselves. Some examples of identity power are heterosexuals proclaiming they are not prejudiced, but simply doing what is just and right by condemning the lifestyles of persons with different sexual orientation and gender identities. That's an individual manifestation. Involving or using persons of different sexual orientation or gender identity to overtly oppose the full inclusion of persons with different sexual orientation or gender identity in churches or in society. That's institutional manifestation. And corporations or churches refusing to portray persons with different sexual orientation or gender identity in society in a positive manner. That's systemic manifestation. Now, in the midst of the 1970s, while serving as General Secretary of the newly created General Board of Discipleship, I accept the invitation to participate in a very special event and engagement in an interaction in Boston, here in Boston, Massachusetts. Participants were told in advance that the group of 30 or more would be a mixture of gay and straight, persons from various sectors of society. The event began Friday evening with dinner and ended with lunch on Sunday. The covenant was to share only our name and the place from which we came. We were not to reveal our vocation or sexual identity until the final session on Sunday morning. Needless to say, at that time, I was homophobic. I brought with me to this occasion all of my biases and stereotypes regarding people who were homosexuals. So throughout that experience, even though we were told to simply engage the process, I decided that I could pick them out. I knew who they were by my own biases and prejudices. But when we were invited to participate and to share our sexual identity and vocations on Sunday morning, I was blown away. All of my stereotypes were shattered. And that day, I made a commitment to God and my soul that I would never again discriminate against another person because of their sexual orientation. And that was the beginning of my journey to who I am today. Out of my own experience, I've come to the realization that homosexuals and heterosexuals are persons of sacred worth and must be granted their full human and civil rights. So I declare to you this day that persons of different sexual orientation or gender identity are members of the family of God, and heterosexuals have no legal or theological grounds on which to declare otherwise. Heterosexism is a sin and an evil that must be identified, confronted, and eradicated from the community. And like racism, heterosexism is an iceberg afloat in our relationships that's in need of thawing and melting so that our rights and privileges can be shared equally and freely as members of the family of God. And now the third iceberg. The third iceberg afloat in our sea of relationship is sexism. I was born and raised in a male-dominated society. That was true in every aspect of my community, the church, the government, the schools, etc. Irrespective of the intellect and competence of women, men had the right and the privilege to prescribe certain roles for women. And that was true for men of every race and culture. And may I suggest that the same held true for men who were part of the gay community. In reality, men of all races and all different sexual orientation or gender identities have prejudices and biases toward women, just as women have biases and prejudices toward men. But sexism is not the same as sexist prejudice. Sexism is sexist prejudice plus power. It is the misuse of sexist systemic power. And my contention is that men with the historic weight of tradition and culture and religion on their side must be open to exploring the depths of our sexism so that the purpose of sexism for the purpose of intentionally taking steps to rid ourselves of the sin and evil of sexism that plagues the church and society. Again, using the iceberg analogy, sexism has three primary manifestations: individual, institutional, and systemic. Likewise, each of these manifestations has three levels: oppressive power, sexist power, and identity power. The oppressive power of sexism is what we see. It is the visible acts or expressions that hurt women of all races or different sexual orientation and gender identity, and deny them their basic human rights and full access to benefits and privileges. For some reason, men tend to justify their acts of injustice and discrimination against women. An example of the oppressive power of sexism is a district superintendent reporting to a bishop that a congregation does not want a woman pastor appointed to the congregation, or a corporation or institution continuing to sustain the invisible glass ceiling that never allow women to break through. A classic example is the most recent selection of leadership for the committees of the U.S. Congress. I want you to watch the next picture that you see. When the speaker comes out, he will have the lone woman walking with him, but right behind him is a long trail of white men. Sexist power is the core of sexism. It is where sexism's purpose resides, because sexism is not really about hurting women. It's about giving privilege and power to men. Within the system of sexism, men are superior to women. The things that happen at the tip of the iceberg, the oppressive power, happen because of the core. Now, while serving as an active bishop, some district superintendents reported to me that churches did not want a woman pastor. And of course, those reports were not the final word. The cabinet and I had a strategy for dealing with such reports. First, the cabinet and I were clear that we would not tolerate discrimination against women. Even though we expected open and honest sharing from the churches, we made it clear that our decision-making process would not be determined by the reports from the churches. Rather, if the bishop and the cabinet concluded that the person possessing the gifts and graces for leading that congregation was a woman, their request for not receiving a woman would not be considered until after they had a consultation with the person we had selected as the best possible choice for that congregation. I'm pleased to report that my cabinet and I never lost a battle. For you see, once people come face to face with the unknown that is another human being, something magical happens. The human dynamic of love and justice and grace turn fear into redemptive action. Identity power is the base of the iceberg. It is the most damaging level of sexism. It is men claiming the power to tell women and other men who they are. Sexism attempts to usurp the authority of God. And it is at the identity power level that sexism shapes men and women and tells us what we think and how we feel about ourselves. And some examples of identity power are men proclaiming they are not prejudiced against women, but they are simply claiming their God-given right to be men. Individual manifestation. involving and using women to overtly oppose the full inclusion of women in churches and other institutions in society, institutional manifestation, and churches and other institutions refusing to portray women in a positive manner in all levels of leadership in church and in society, systemic manifestation. Like racism and heterosexism, sexism is an iceberg afloat in the sea of our human experiences in every aspect of our society. It is an evil and a sin against humanity. It must be identified, confronted, and eradicated so that our human relationships can flourish without serious interruptions. So in conclusion, I'm deeply indebted to the authors of the book Set Free, A Journey Toward Solidarity Against Racism. Too often, we find ourselves dealing with symptoms. The iceberg concept suggests that in human relations, greater efforts should be placed on probing the depths to explore a broader understanding of what causes us to do things and to do the things that we do to each other. During this week of remembering the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., we hold before us his vision for a beloved community. It is my contention that the beloved community cannot be realized without focusing attention on the loaded icebergs of racism, heterosexism, and sexism afloat in our midst. Now, in this lecture, I have presented 3 distinct cases for issues which lead to the intersection of oppression and privilege. I have not said anything about power. It is my experience that power has been both enabling and controlling. It has been abusive and empowering. Yet, in each of the 3 cases I used in this session are issues are used in an abusive manner. In each of these cases, power has become corrupt. Quoting the English philosopher Edmund Burke, Dr. King frequently said, "All that is necessary for evil to triumph is for good men, and I say good people, to do nothing." Now, my sisters and brothers, from the beginning, evil existed in the world, and you and I know that there's a lot of evil lurking in our lives today. And as people of faith, we are called by God to be part of the force for good in the world so that evil will not triumph. And it is my prayer that God's Spirit will prod us into being active agents for the common good of all creation. May we use all of our resources, all of our power to eradicate the sin and evil of racism, heterosexism, and sexism from all of our relationships in society, and especially in our church. Thank you.
I think I hear an advocate for a different kind of global warming and melting of icebergs. Your applause expressed your appreciation. My guess is some of the appreciation is so deep within our thinking that it's going to take a while to absorb and come to an awareness of the fullness of what we've heard. we now invite our two respondents to come individually. And I think at least Will is going to come to the platform. Will Green will be responding first, followed by Dean Lightsey. And each of them has been given a certain number of minutes. I won't tell you, but they know. and they know that I will invite them to conclude at a certain point by simply standing in my seat. And then after they have responded, I will invite Bishop Talbert and the two respondents to have some conversation together if they wish. And then we will open it up for dialogue, for questions from any of you who wish to do that. So,
thank you.
Thank you. This is very overwhelming. Begin by saying when I read the invitation to participate, I was grateful to see that it said I was being asked to speak from the heart. And I thought, I'm a Methodist preacher, I can do that. So if this sounds more like a prepared sermon and less like my attempt to respond off the cuff immediately, then you're welcome. The text for this sermon, which I have prayed about and studied, and which has disclosed to me a word from God, is seated directly next to me and was standing at the podium a moment ago, Bishop Talbert. Before saying how he has moved me, I want to start by naming something about my life. I want to start by admitting that I have a problem. There are two parts of my identity that I have trouble reconciling. It's not being Christian and gay. Those things go together very well for me. But I am referring to my dual identity around the United Methodist Church. Here's where I'm going. I am someone who is committed to working on the technical problems of running the United Methodist Church. And I'm also a parish pastor. This is a conflict for me because being in ministry in our denomination, in a local church, and then denominational management can create tensions in my life. What do I even call this side of the equation? You might say I'm a bureaucrat. That's when I get elected and appointed to things, and when my agenda wins and votes, I'm a bureaucrat. But when it loses and I get kicked out, I become an activist. So whatever it is, it's being involved in the United Methodist Church and also serving people in a local church. This can create tension that I bet some of the pastors in the room can identify with. On the structure side of things with the church, we work to craft language that will pass committee votes. But then on the service side of things, every day of our lives, we tell people not to be held back by that sort of stuff. And we preach that they should instead learn to live with embodied integrity, no matter what the structure of the church says. On the structure side of things, we focus on votes at General Conference. But on the service side of things, we focus on lives in our community. This goes back and forth. On this side of things, we protest things that must change, and then over here, we help people follow Christ wherever they are, here and now. This side tries to organize activists. Very difficult. And this side just shares the gospel and lets it go free. So my problem comes down to this. I'm trying to serve people in a church that has enough issues all on its own. It's hard to help people find the God of their wholeness in a church that is broken. So at times I feel trapped by the reality of the limitations and the restrictions that are all around me in ministry. And also, I'm both a pastor and an activist involved in the church, and it's difficult for me. So plenty of people are much more trapped than I am. People who are in the closet. People who are just trying to take much smaller steps than reforming the book of discipline. You know, can I carry this sign in public? Can I wear a pin? Can I just tell the truth? This challenge is a reality. And I don't think that this challenge is going to go away in 2016 when we have our next General Conference of the United Methodist Church. In fact, I think things would probably get worse and continue to become more homophobic in our church structure. But this brings me to our guest of honor, Bishop Talbert. I give thanks to God for Bishop Talbert's words. In particular, I'm thinking his words on the last day of General Conference, when he declared to our church very clearly a statement that's been called either an altar for all. Have you read it? Have you seen it? Or it's been called biblical obedience. Have you signed it? Are you doing it? I've got some of your words here. On that day, you very clearly said that within the United Methodist Church, derogatory language and restrictive laws are immoral, unjust, and no longer deserve our loyalty and obedience. Don't you love it?
Yeah.
By the way, if there's any middle school student in confirmation in your local church who isn't really clear that this is the only appropriate reaction to oppression already, then you want to help them with that and get to a better place. This is obvious for most of us. The bishop is simply and scandalously repeating our ancient instructions to proclaim the gospel. Our mandate to offer Christ and to be, as you have said, to be pastoral in the normal course of our pastoral ministry is a hope that's not based on our ability to solve all the technical problems of the United Methodist Church. And it's not focused on our ability to overcome all of the obvious issues that we face. But instead, the bishop is sharing a hope that connects us to God's faithfulness that is alive in us, despite the distracting challenges of reality. Now, let me tell you a story that some of you lived with me. This is a good memory I have from General Conference 2012. There are some good memories. Don't worry. This is a good one. It took place during the second day of our holy conferencing, our second holy conferencing session. Some of you remember, because you designed it, I think, that we had a few different conversations around key issues in the church. First, we had a conversation around sexuality. We had some issues in that conversation. Bullying and other bad things happened. Also signs of life, but there were some bad things that happened. But this conversation was, I think it was called Regional Issues, if I've got it right, where we divided up according to geographic area on the globe. All the delegates from the United States of America were in the main convention center hall. And they were about to have their discussion about issues for people that are being faced in the United States of America. Now picture this hall. I'm going to describe it for you. Not surprisingly, for the United Methodist Church, it was just a horrible structure. It was like an airplane hangar. I mean, it was a really, really, really difficult space. It was huge, 1,000 people seated here, and then way down far, if you look down that way, a long way away at the end of this cavernous rectangle was the stage. And that's where the microphones, the instruments, and all the cameras were focused. Way down there, that's where the podiums were, where the bishop sat, and where perhaps the power was. And stretching backwards from them, reaching far, far away, were the people of God. Just seemed to go on forever. You've heard of too big to fail. The structure was too big to function. It was a ridiculous space. Now, this meant, as those of us who were in the bleachers, as we looked much more prominent than the front, which you needed binoculars to find, were the long lines that marked the margins. I was in the who else was in the bleachers with me? Johnny were there, and many others. Many others were there. We were a church, as we looked from those bleachers, to my eyes, that were defined by straight lines that marked who's inside and who's outside. Now, we were off in the bleachers. At that moment, I was an activist, not a bureaucrat, and we were looking to interrupt and to make a witness. We didn't have access to the stage or to the microphones, but through our friend Marla Markham from the Better Future Project, we had the people's mic. Some of you know this from the Occupy movement. It's a call and response method where you take over with your voices. Here's what I'm getting at. When we spoke from the sidelines, in the bleachers, outside the lines, in that huge space. When we spoke, the room changed its shape. Because all of the delegates on that huge floor were called to bring their focus to a new point in the room. And the faces just turned. When our focus changes, we change. And once we spoke from the sidelines, we saw a transformation. What once were profiles suddenly became people. And I'm reminded what the bishop said about the chance that the cabinet created for people to sit down and have conversations, to look at each other. And in the bleachers, outside the dividing wall, we realized that we had much more access to each other than we had led ourselves to believe. I learned, we can do this. We just have to act like those obstacles do not exist. They do not deserve our obedience and our respect anymore. We can speak up and we can overcome some things. That time, and in this one situation, which is particular, we didn't get in any trouble at all. In fact, once we finished, they said, okay, right back to business. But once they did go back to business, I do remember, in my memory anyways, some of the delegates finding within themselves permission to walk off the floor and come join us up in the bleachers. They were attracted by the joy of telling the truth from where you stand. There's nothing like it in the world. When we speak a truthful word that is relevant to the moment, we give permission for people to be free. We reach people who the power structure simply cannot reach. And even if they could reach, they wouldn't know how to communicate with them to begin with. So don't worry about that, because they're so hindered by their own sense of structure. I think that it was that experience that gave us the creativity and the courage to twice later in General Conference just walk on the floor and go to the communion table. And also in our witness at the edges, we helped many people, including bishops and voting delegates, find a new place to stand at the edges where they could disregard what had once held them back. Okay, now we'll have a little bit of fun with this if you all don't get too excited. With some quick examples from the Bible and from Methodist history and from life in ministry. First, I just want to say, remember my problem about wrestling with structure and having the opportunity to be in service. And apply what the bishop said in the Altar for All call to obedience statement. Unjust structures no longer hold our respect, and we can just focus on the normal course of pastoral ministry. Then we can be obedient. I just have one issue with that phrase, Bishop, in the phrase, the normal course of pastoral ministry, and that is the use of the word normal. There is no such thing as a normal course of pastoral ministry. When we behave as if the all too real restrictions, obstacles, and divisions that are built up by sin are not worth comparing to the power of God who is really in control, we may not be normal, but we are faithful. And when we are obedient to the God who really rules the world around us, we bring a new focus and are no longer just so many profiles out there in the chaos. I'm glad you're about to stand, okay? But we ourselves are transformed into being full persons God calls us to be. Allow me to quickly summarize here. I just want to go through some of these. You're going to like this. The Hebrew midwives in Egypt. Do you remember them? When they realized that it was up to them to defy death, to love life, and to break the law, they were being obedient to the God who really rules this world. Whenever people who are thirsty and have no money but come to the waters anyway and drink, they are defying the restrictive laws that serve no purpose other than oppressing outsiders. You see where I'm going with this? When Mary, when her soul magnified the Lord, she herself was demonstrating that the unjust and pointless limitations that others had built up just to keep her down were not going to prohibit her any longer. When Peter fell into a trance, just long enough to start to hear voices that freed him from being forced to live divided any longer, He was remembering where his loyalty really lies. We're almost there. Don't forget, every Methodist knows this story. When a neurotic, emotionally tortured young man can let go of his own issues and psychological self-defense mechanisms long enough to feel that his heart is strangely warmed, then he is behaving as if the old internal obstacles don't have power over him anymore. Hold this example very tenderly, friends. When a stranger in your community, a newcomer from somewhere else who doesn't know anyone else, stands up on a Sunday morning in front of a room full of strangers, and despite all the immorality and injustice and restrictions that the world throws at them, when they are asked, perhaps by you, do you confess Jesus Christ as your Savior? Put your whole trust in his grace and promise to serve him as Lord in union with the church, which God has opened to people of all ages, nations, and races. And then they are ridiculous enough to say, I do. That they are behaving as if every pointless rule in this world no longer exists. Here's my last example. When two lesbian women are so faithful and so full of love that they want to give each other rings with the words, this ring is a symbol of my love for you and our commitment to be united. Wear this ring and be my love. Don't you want to be the clergy person who says, seal this covenant with a kiss, amen? That's what being obedient to God is all about. None of these examples are ends in themselves, but they all witness to a higher law of love that connect us to God on God's own terms. So I hope that sharing from the heart has allowed you to share a little bit of the joy that I know through Bishop Talbert's witness. Thanks.
I will limit my remarks because I want to allow you all to have some questions and answer time. So if you'll hold me to 5 minutes only, and I'll try to say, yes, I'm serious. I think we're supposed to end at 7:30, is that correct? Okay, so I want to... Okay, well, a little leeway, but maybe 5 to 7. So I'll try to hold that because I really believe in the synergy that takes place when we're allowed to have conversations amongst ourselves. So let me begin by sharing what I was thinking earlier this morning. Earlier this morning, as I was thinking about this week being the week where we celebrate the birth of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., I clearly thought to myself, it troubles me when people say Martin Luther King Jr. died. Martin Luther King Jr. did not die. And no, I'm not trying to say that he like Tupac, or Elvis Presley, that he still lives. No, he didn't die. He was assassinated. And I think we ought to remember that. That's very important. His life was ended as he was engaged in civil disobedience. And for the purpose, he was truly involved. He truly wanted civil discourse. So he embodied what we're trying to discuss here tonight. And today, in 2013, we are still faced with many of the same challenges for which Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated. We are living in a very polarized society. And I'm not simply speaking about the United States of America or the United Methodist Church, but I'm saying we live in a polarized world where people are incapable very often of engaging in civil discourse. More often than not, what we attempt to do is you see people walk into a room with their minds already made up. And to me, that lacks integrity. Civil discourse is when you enter an environment honest with the integrity that says, I reserve the right to have my opinion changed because I have been with you. Context. The United Methodist Church has not engaged its lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer folk honestly. And I would also say it has not engaged its heterosexual folk honestly, because it attempts to silence the voices of its membership through its polity that says homosexual persons or homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching. And also through another paragraph that allows pastors to deny membership from persons who want to become a member of the body of Christ in our local church. Now, how does the church do that? Not only through its polity, but also when we come together at General Conference. We've articulated what is called holy conferencing, a term that I have come to despise. Because there's very little about holy conferencing. What holy conferencing has become is an attempt to silence the voices of persons that will not commit to living their lives as the church or as the church's polity demands they live. And Bishop Talbert, you said something early on when you were talking about racism, being in the environment of racism. You said, I knew within my soul that I could not survive that environment, so I sought to escape. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and heterosexual folk are recognizing that we cannot survive within an environment that seeks to silence us, that refuses to allow honest civil discourse. And when you attempt to silence the voice of a people, they have a moral responsibility to disobey law. And you see this in the civil rights movement. In 2008, I'm trying to get here. In 2008, I was sitting in my office at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary. They were live streaming the General Conference of the United Methodist Church. Somewhere in there, holy conferencing, whatever, had broken down. And some very vile attacks began to take place on the floor of the United Methodist Church's General Conference. Bishop Talbert, I heard his voice. I heard the voice of this man say, "Church, let's not do this." And this voice began to recount to the church the history of racism within what we now call the United Methodist Church. And this voice began to weave together the history of oppression that's written in our book of discipline, which we refuse to look at to this day and say, look, we're going down the same path. And the voice was Bishop Talbert. And I sat in my office and I began to cry because he was trying to engage the church in civil discourse in a way that he was trying to encourage people to be willing to hear each other respectfully, to be changed by each other's voices, and to come to some kind of peaceful resolution that does not attempt to squash people from being their authentic self. And when I heard Bishop Talbert, I began to cry in my office, and I began the process the next week of coming out to the president of my seminary. I've been out with my children for years, but I began to take the step to come out where across the church and within the seminary. I needed to do that because I knew I couldn't survive in the manner in which I was living, and I just need to be my most authentic self. Another thing I want to say before I sit down, not only must our church recommit itself and begin to look at civil discourse differently, the church must also recognize that the civil disobedience or the biblical obedience that Bishop Talbert is asking and encouraging us to commit ourselves to did not come to the church tabula rasa. Just as civil disobedience at the time of King did not occur tabula rasa, so also this cry for civil obedience. It comes after years and after many sessions of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender folk trying to get the church to do what God has called it to do and to be what God has called it to be. And there comes a moment in the life of any movement where the leaders and the members of that movement say enough is enough. Like Fannie Lou Hamer, they will say, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. And lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer folk are sick and tired of the church trying to squash out their voice. And they're sick and tired of the church trying to legislate them to be what they know God did not call them to be. We simply want to exist in a church and be the people of sacred worth that the church says that we are. And so in 2012, when Bishop Talbert says to us, look, we will be biblically obedient, all of this is a process. This has been a process. And now it's reached the tip of the iceberg. And we are fighting now the oppressive power of the church. We need to do that. And I thank you for being here so we can continue to engage that. Thank you, Bishop.
Megan, would you please set that up, please?
Yes.
The diagram.
Yes.
I think we need that as our altar piece. I guess we will.
Did she understand that you wanted it to stay?
Oh, sorry.
She
Yes.
wanted it
You want
to
the
stay.
weight?
I would like to have the image stay before us as we engage in conversation, because there are various forms of altarpieces, and I think that's a very significant one for us to have before us as we engage in this conversation. Thank you.
Light on, okay? Light on or?
The light on will be okay. We'll manage. I'd first like to invite, first gratitude both to Will and to Pamela for your responses. And I would first like to invite the three of you. Is there a comment that you want to say to each other before we open it to the body?
I would just like to begin by saying my word of appreciation to both of you for your responses, and Will in particular. You called me out on the use of the word norm. Thank you. That's very helpful. And you captured what I intended by using that expression, but simply by using that word, I think it took away what I was trying to say. So I will not use that word.
There's nothing normal about you.
Well, I want to thank Will and Bishop Talbert for sharing with us their life experience. I think sometimes we take for granted that it's very easy for people to share or to peel back the layers to show who they are beyond what we see day to day. It's not an easy process. And so to the extent that they've done that, I really appreciate that. I'm intrigued, Bishop Talbert, by your helping us to understand the distinction between racism and prejudice. And I think that's very important, and I hope we all got that today. And I think that, you know, as I made a note, prejudice plus power equals all of these isms.
Right.
I'm old enough to have gone through the point where I've had men point their fingers in my face and tell me, as a 19-year-old woman called to preach, that God did not call any woman to preach, and that I ought to sit down and shut up, otherwise I was going to hell. So I appreciate the distinction that you placed there.
I have just one thing to say. I think I can just go like this, right? Thank you. Okay. Oh, okay. Thank you doesn't begin. And just to be at this table is awesome. Thank you all. I feel a little strange about something I said, and something I say a lot, and something I believe, encouraging people to ministry in the United Methodist Church and GLBT people, especially in light of what the bishop shared about how, and also what the dean shared about risking lives. Because so often I say to people, and I do think it's true and helpful at times, to say, get over it. It's a bit, you know, about performing this wedding or about whatever, like, you can do this. This is not that big a deal. So I want to acknowledge the different realities of different ways that we have witnessed and been in ministry, and how there are plenty of times stuff that, you know, aren't even going to be shared in this room, about risks that I can't even imagine. So I just wanted to say that.
Thank you to all three of you for that dialogue. We obviously do not have a lot of time for conversation. I've been told that we must be finished here by 20:00. Now, I can't see that clock.
You got 15 minutes, Bishop.
But I would invite you, if you have a question to give to the panel, if you would stand up, and I will try to listen and repeat the question so that everybody can hear it, and it be gathered, recorded also. So what questions, and if you want to address the question to a particular panelist, please feel free to name them. Gary?
The issue of risk and privilege, you've mentioned risk, and especially as MLK Day and all of that, we sort of recall the risk, because MLK, when he was assassinated, was not a popular figure, let's be honest. And he's sort of been neutralized and purified and everything else. But the point, I guess my point is, a lot of us, and I'm from point of privilege, I even get paid by the church for not doing anything anymore. A lot of us are in a situation where, you know, to take seriously that risk. And that is that I'm not going to be pulled out of the church, I'm not going to be denied ordination, I'm not going to be any of that kind of thing, and yet there's still a role. It occurs to me that in many cases,
Gary.
Huh? In many cases, we try to get into comfort without facing that call to risk.
I think that life itself is a risk. And the moment that we decide that, you know, what did Martin Luther King say by quoting Burke? You know, as good people in this society, we remain silent. And let me just say, our country's going to hell right now because we got congressional leaders who are not acting for the common good. And yet we got good people in our churches who are not speaking out. They're not saying anything. They're allowing it to happen. And, you know, if we don't take some risk, what we're doing is saying the status quo is acceptable. That's my response.
And I want to say that Martin Luther King was exceptionally popular. He was popular enough for COINTELPRO, you know, the counterintelligence movement to be the FBI to be targeting him. He was not accepted in many spheres, but in the African American context, he was very popular and quite beloved, not by all, but very popular and quite beloved. And I make that point to say this: within every group, there is a subgroup. And so everyone does not agree within groups. Within the LGBTQ community, we have our own challenges. And we have yet to work them out. Challenges of racism, sexism, classism, discussions about being bisexual and transgender. We need to work out our ish. And we haven't done that fully yet. So there are these challenges.
I'm going to go back here. You, sir?
I'm curious how the panel would respond to the distinction between power held by people and the power of an idea. I think you did a really wonderful job of talking about sexist power versus racist power versus heterosexist power, of certain people wanting to hold on to the power that they have around those things. As an openly identified trans person who is also clergy, I am often faced with people of any particular sex, of any particular sexual orientation, or of any particular race, really holding up the gender binary as the thing that is the thing. Right? And anything else, any other recognition of any other gender identity or gender nonconformity is the thing that I am fighting against. I'm working to get through an idea that is so deeply held that the idea in and of itself has the most power, not any particular demographic of people. So I'm trying to figure out how to work through that kind of power. So if any or all of you could speak to that, I would appreciate it.
Are you suggesting that that's even another level?
It feels like a different level.
That's what I was hearing you ask.
It feels like a different level. Changing the hearts and minds of people can happen, and I've witnessed it happen, and I go into churches and work with folks around those sorts of things. But those ideas that are so deeply held feels like it comes from a different place and needs to be approached differently. I'm not sure if that's right, but that's how it feels.
I'll say something. Thanks for that question, the topic. It sounds very exciting, your ministry, and it seems that asking those big questions and inviting people to move into that new space is the heart and soul of Christian ministry and following Christ. Yes, I'm thrilled, and it never ends where the lines never fall where we think they're going to. It's very exciting.
Yeah, I said I didn't say very much about power, but throughout my whole life, I understand that each individual has in his or herself power given by God, power that's intended to be used. The question is, how are we going to use it? Are we going to use it for good or for evil? And what I'm trying to do is to call people forth to use the power that is within them, God given, for the common good of all humanity, rather than joining the forces of evil that are excluding some and including others.
But I think I also hear you say, I think I'm hearing you asking us not necessarily to dispel with normativity, But I think I'm hearing you challenge us to begin to think of ways that we can dispel the kind of normativity that oppresses, which is what Bishop Talbert was talking about. And I think that in order to do that, we should embrace a certain type of grace in our conversation that allows persons seated around the table to make errors to have errors in language. You saw a perfect example of that. Such that persons who are our allies are not put on the back burner just because they don't have the language to engage us. But that we embody some sort of grace to say, okay, I really get where you're trying to go. Let me help you articulate that in a better way. Let me help you articulate that for transgender persons, for queer persons. Is that?
That's right.
One more question. I see one in the front row.
I was at a general conference. I'm a United Methodist pastor, clergy, who hanging on by my fingernails. And I think I want to go back to general conference in 3.5 years from now. And I guess I'd like to hear some wisdom of how to be present. Not just by myself, but with some of the people that we talked about.
I'm not sure if you heard that in the back. The question is, Reverend Todd had been at General Conference as a volunteer, just hanging on, wondering how to think about returning. What word might the panels provide in giving him some hope and some direction?
Let me say something. You have more power and authority than you think. You talked about the system that we are in. I'm saying it's time for us to stop spending all of our time and energy trying to work and maneuver that. Let's focus on where it makes a difference. There are clergy and lay folk in the communities where you live who want to hear your voice. They don't want you to be silent anymore. They want to hear what you got to say about the issues that they are facing, and particularly the issue of an inclusion of GLBT people. And if you want to make a difference over the next 3 years, you ought to be finding as many clergy, and particularly the younger clergy, that you can, and speak to them as colleagues in ministry and urge them to come to grips with who they are and to take responsibility for their lives and to witness in the name of Jesus Christ. And take this issue head on and give them some courage to stand up and be over against this immoral laws and actions that are causing us to have such a pall of fear over us. Yes. The question people ask me is, aren't you overwhelmed by the responses that you're getting because of your stance? The answer is no. Conversations are going on up here in the air, but none of them are talking to me. You know? and the same will be true for you. You know, you just got to say to folk, do the right thing. Do what is right. Do what is just. And let the chips fall where they may. And you can do that. You know, and clergy, particularly younger clergy and layfolk, are waiting to hear voices like yours. And then you would go back to General Conference and see what happens. But as was said earlier, I'm not too hopeful.
I want to say that I love the church. I really do. The United Methodist Church has meant a lot to me. And I came to the United Methodist Church in 1991. Because I critique the church does not mean I'm an anarchist. I believe some of the laws of the church ought to be changed. I believe, by and large, the United Methodist Church has a whole lot of beauty within it. And I stayed within the church because I've seen lives change because of the ministry of the United Methodist Church. and I'm not willing to give that up. I rooted myself in the United Methodist Church. Now they may try to put me out, but I love the church, and I think for the church to survive and to be the flagship prophetic instrument that God has called it to be, requires persons like you and I to stay engaged with the church. And so I encourage that.
We thank you for your thoughtful, provocative questions, for your thoughtful, provocative responses. And as a preacher, I can't leave without offering a challenge for going forth. And that challenge for going forth has to start with my own confession. This is not on the notes that I had planned to use. But as I sat here, I saw the image as being that of a frozen heart. And the reference was made to John Wesley's heartwarming experience. Well, thank you. John Wesley's heartwarming experience didn't come easy for him. And the word I would like to speak is primarily to the white heterosexuals among us, including me, to name where we are even below the visible in terms of our imbibing the power, the inappropriate naming. It is for us to primarily, Jim, work on this process of that heartwarming, that ice melting, that will bring peace and justice. I have recently been reading a book by Parker Palmer, The Heart of Democracy. Some of you, it has been a bestseller recently. And Parker Palmer talks about the core, the heart of democracy, the heart of the church. And he gives the illustration of John Woolman, a Quaker in the 1700s, who became so convicted of his own racism that he gave up his slaves. He tried to convince his Quaker meeting to give up their slaves. They didn't. But that Quaker meeting tended his farm and his business as John Woolman went up and down the East Coast from his home in New Jersey for 20 years, trying to convince fellow Quakers that they were wrong. He'd eat with them if the food wasn't prepared by the slaves. He wore clothing that was not dyed with colors that had to be produced by slaves. He lived it, he talked it, he engaged in civil discourse. He went back to his meeting in New Jersey, and eventually, through their discourse, built a consensus around giving up slavery. 80 years before that happened for the nation, through the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation that we honor today. There is still work to be done on racism, heterosexism. It's harder, I feel the sexism, but it's harder for me to speak to that. But I urge all of us here to see what heartwarming do we need. Who among us is going to be a John Woolman? Thank you.
Thank you again tonight for being here. We have rewarded you with a bit of a repast, so please stop, converse with each other, and make sure there is nothing left on any plate. Okay, thank you again.